Hey everyone, it's May, and welcome to another episode of the May Lee Show. Glad you could join me. Right now, I'm shooting the open to this particular episode in the evening, which I normally don't do. I usually try to do everything in the daytime, but I've been teaching all day and had to fight through rush hour traffic to get home to be able to do this. So that's why I'm shooting this in the evening. So that's why if you're watching, it has this sort of nighttime evening vibe or look, right? And for those of you who are listening via podcast, this is totally meaningless to you. So sorry about that. Um, Listen, before I start this particular episode, I wanted to share some pretty big news that came out today. And right now it's September 15th when I'm recording this particular open. And it's the fact that Stop AAPI leaders named to Time's annual 100 list of the most influential people in the world. That's a very big deal. So they named the AAPI, Stop AAPI Hate co founders Cynthia Choi, Manjusha Kulkarni, and Russell Jung to the 2021 Time 100 Most Influential list. It's a very big deal to be put on this list and to be recognized this way. So here's a quote from the press release. It is a great honor to be recognized for this award among this list of influential leaders, said Manjusha Kulkarni, co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate and executive director of Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council. This work would not be possible without the bravery and strength of our respondents and the AAPI community at large, and we want to thank them for their willingness to speak out against injustice. This award is a testament to the fact that our advocacy work is being valued and it validates our fight against anti Asian hate. Yes, it does. Being recognized in this manner by such a notable publication and being put on this very, very recognized list is a huge deal. And like Manjusha said, it means that their work is being valued. It's being recognized. It validates this fight that we've all been fighting for almost 2 years now, and it's still ongoing. Even if others have moved on and the mainstream media seems to have moved on, hey, time is recognizing this. So it's a very big deal. And I'm not trying to take away anyone's thunder, but I want to draw this parallel. When I was put on the Forbes impact list, the Forbes 50 over 50 impact list a couple months ago, the reason why I was so honored was it wasn't about me. They were recognizing the work, the advocacy work to stop anti Asian hate. And the fact that these very established publications are recognizing the importance of what we're doing and the importance of this movement is why it's such a big deal. So, congrats to the Stop AAPI Hate organization, especially the co founders. Definitely well deserved. And I just want to say that it is activists like them and organizations like Stop AAPI Hate that do the real work. They're the ones on the ground doing the real work. They don't get a lot of recognition, right? It's the shiny people, it's the famous people who tend to get a lot of the glory. But these are the real folks who are doing the work on a daily basis and fighting the good fight, even when nobody is recognizing them, even when nobody knows their names, right? So to be recognized in this way and to be honored in this way, I think is, yeah, it's amazing. So I was so pleased when I saw this news. So congrats to them all. All right. Well, today's episode, I interviewed somebody from the AAPI Victory Alliance, and he is the executive director, Varun Nikore. He has a long history in politics, having worked in politics in different administrations, as well as being campaign advisors to different folks running for office. But AAPI Victory Alliance is an organization that uh, really tries to provide education about issues and political issues and social issues that have to do with the AAPI community. But they also try to build alliances with different organizations, and they try to cultivate AAPI political leaders, of the future, which we need desperately. So it's a great organization, but I wanted to talk to Varun about several issues going on right now in the country. Not just the I just the issue of the importance of the growing AAPI political power and the AAPI vote, right? And we all know that we are the fastest growing voting bloc in the country, even though a lot of folks outside of our community don't know that, and even prominent politicians are a little clueless on that. So we still go largely ignored sometimes, but we are definitely making inroads. And so therefore our power is growing. So therefore people are starting to pay more attention. So we talk about that, but we also talk about what's going on right now with voting rights. And oftentimes when the subject of voting rights is discussed, um, you hear about how that's going to affect the Black communities, the Latinx communities, and there's barely a mention of AAPIs. And let's be clear, the AAPI community will also be affected by restrictive voting rights. So we're going to explain that in the interview as well. We also talk about the continuing anti-Asian hate in this country and what how politics can play a bigger role in that. Uh, and finally, we also talk about the end of the Afghanistan war, and how that's affecting Afghan refugees who are flying everywhere, but many of whom are coming here to the United States, and the fear that they might be mistreated and there might be a lot of backlash. So that's a discussion that I wanted to have with Varun as well. So we cover a lot of ground. We cover a lot of ground, but it really is about the overarching theme of AAPI communities, politics, voting, power, and influence, and how we can harness that a bit better in order to have a bigger voice, have a seat or several seats at the table, which we still need to have, and make a difference. So here is my interview with Varun Nikore. Varun, welcome to the show. So glad to have you.
So good to be with you, May.
Yeah, thank you. Well, there is so much going on in the world, as we know, and it seems to be endless in terms of news and developments. But I know that AAPI Victory Alliance really focuses on, obviously, Asian American Pacific Islander issues. And one being that's really urgent right now is the idea of voting rights and how that's under siege right now. We saw what just happened in Texas. Seems to be a lot going on in Texas these days, huh, Varun?
It is the topic du jour more ways than one.
Yeah.
It's ground zero for AAPIs and national progressives.
Yeah, exactly. So in Texas, it is obviously setting a precedent in terms of changing voting rights, and the whole idea being restricting voting rights. They're saying no more 24-hour voting. In mail-in balloting is going to be very limited. IDs have to be presented, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole list of changes. But for the lay person, tell us why this is so significant and how this is truly going to have possibly a ripple effect across the country.
Yeah, and so it started in Georgia and Arizona. Then the Republican legislature there cookie cuttered the Georgia laws, and then Texas took it up. Of course, we know that the Texas Democrats walked out
Yeah.
over the summer, and I was working with some folks on in the Texas Democratic establishment to try to, provide input however I could from an API angle. But the reason it's so significant is this, and how it affects APIs
Yeah.
as well is that right. So you've got one party that wants to expand voting access. You've got another party, the Republicans, that want to restrict it, and they are obviously scared about what they saw out of this last election with the record level turnout. Of course, they also had record level turnout, so there could be a downside risk for Republicans that they're not realizing that it could actually clamp down on some of their ballot access,
Yeah.
right? But to get to the heart of the matter, who were the folks that were that contributed the most to the Democratic victory were people of color
Yep.
at the end of the day. Yes, there were an increase in white turnout, male and female educated voters and that sort of thing. But For AAPIs, we came out in such record levels in 2020. So overall, there was a 12% increase in voting between 16 and 2020. That represented a 100-year record in voting. AAPIs came out at a 47% increase,
Yeah.
almost 4 times the national increase.
I remember when I saw
So
that data when it first came out, I was shocked. I mean, I knew they were going to come out. I knew the community was going to come out because it was such an important election. But man, that figure, that data point really blew me away.
we should all be proud.
Yes. Yes, we should.
We should be proud because we closed in almost 15% undervoting margin in one election cycle,
Right.
one presidential election cycle. Never happened before in the history of this country, we believe. I've never had anybody who tells me, well, maybe in the late 1800s, the Irish vote increased in New York City by X percent.
Right.
Never had anybody tell me that. So I'm gonna go with that. So the folks in Georgia, right? I mean, Biden won Georgia by 12,000 votes or so,
Right.
and then we won those 2 Senate seats in the Senate runoffs by larger margins than that. And AAPIs were recognized by national analysts and pollsters that it was because of our increase in voting that it provided not only Biden but Schumer and all Democrats those victories. But also in Arizona, we saw the same.
Yeah.
Right. So if you think about the areas, those two geographies right there, Georgia and Arizona. Georgia was the first to come up with these massive voter rights restrictions, and then right after that, Arizona. But what even though we did not win Texas, we closed the gap on
Yep.
a presidential level by 2 percentage points from 2016, and we got within 5 points or so of winning the state. And Texan Republicans in Texas are extremely terrified that they saw the number of people of color, but our vote was not only one of the highest increases in the state of Texas, but our community voted with the most amount of increase in the early vote and absentee vote period. And
Mhm.
that's absolutely critical because a lot of these restrictions that we are seeing in Texas and the other states directly will impede the types of early voting and absentee voting
Right.
of which we participated in larger margins.
Yeah, and that is the interesting point is that the AAPI community prefers, it seems, to do the early voting, the absentee ballot. And so that will greatly affect that, if that's restricted, clearly they're not going to be able to participate in that way. And that might drop off then in terms of their participation. So let me ask you this, Varun, and I always was interested and kind of perplexed by this. It seems that when the news media or whenever even politicians speak of the importance of communities of color and their vote and how they might be impacted by the change in voting rights, they seem to only talk about the African American vote and maybe the Latinx vote, and there's hardly a mention of the AAPI vote still. And that is a problem, don't you think? I mean, because they have to realize the importance of our growing voter base, right? And the fact that we are the fastest growing voting bloc in the country. And yet that still doesn't seem to be getting across in the messaging. What do you think that is?
Our institutions, our progressive institutions, including the DNC, and I would say the White House and large super PACs on the left and progressive organizations still have not come to terms and reconciled with the fact that we are starting now to participate in elections like never before. So all those great stats I mentioned about 2020, if one had been watching the stats out of the special elections that occurred when Trump, say, nominated a congressman or someone like that to his cabinet or to a executive post, there was all these special elections. if you look at the data from the special elections, API turnout through the roof in
Yeah.
2017.
Yeah.
Virginia elections 2017 through the roof. 2018 midterms. We have never seen turnout like that from the API community. So there was all these indicators happening, and yet there was very little investment.
Mm.
The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, which focuses on House races, did make early investments in Orange County in early 2017,
Yeah.
and we won 3
Yep.
seats.
Yep.
Right, large populations of AAPI, depending on the district, between 20 and 28% AAPI in some of those congressional districts.
Oh
But
yeah.
what happened after we won? The DCCC didn't make it a priority, and then we lost 2 out of those 3 seats
Yeah,
in
exactly.
2020.
Exactly. So
Right?
the proof is in the pudding, right? So the
Proof
data's
is in
there, but I still, to this day, I still notice, and I pay close attention, that there's still not this emphasis or even this acknowledgement, right? And so therefore, we are still, I hate to say this, it's almost like we're still being invisibilized in many ways in the political arena. Even remember, President Biden has gotten a lot of flack because he did not nominate an Asian cabinet member. So there still seems to be this disconnect in terms of our growing power as a community, but then not the recognition and the desire to really cultivate, you know.
There is this massive confusion, I would say, you know, almost ignorance, let's call it,
Yeah, let's call
of
it
the
that.
API community,
Yeah.
right? So as a campaign specialist, as a political operative, what one thing that I look at is, okay, well, what does our win number have to be? What calculus of the Korean vote plus the Vietnamese American vote plus the Chinese and Indian and Filipino and other communities, the PI vote and others, do we need to get in a state legislative district, congressional district, or a state to win a Senate race, that sort of thing. And when you run the numbers, you calculate, okay, how you achieve your win margin and how much investment dollars you need to put into each community, right? So it's complex.
Yeah.
So it's complex for someone who's been doing this for a while, but for someone, frankly, and most campaign operatives on the left are white,
Yeah.
and they, unless they're forced to deal with it by, working in a congressional district that, let's say, is 20% or 30% API, then they are largely, for most part, going to ignore this smaller vote.
Right.
But what we proved in this last election in Arizona and in Georgia, that even though our populations were small, 6% or so in Georgia, 4% in Arizona, is that even when you are small, in tight margin elections, and when was the last time we haven't had a tight margin
Yeah.
election,
Yeah.
that it is absolutely critical you go after every last vote. So my edict to the progressive community is, let's get smart, because otherwise we are going to lose elections. And if we invest on the front end,
Yeah.
then we have an opportunity to flip very critical geographies that we haven't flipped before. I'll give you an example. Florida, there is no ecosystem, no infrastructure for API to APIs to organize.
Really.
So we have been working behind the scenes, and 2 weeks ago we announced the launch of a new API 501c4 organization that's going to do year-round organizing.
Yep.
And we got critical investment from the Florida donor table, because they recognized that this was largely a community that had not gone invested in. And with about, I think, around a 5% API population in Florida. Now, if you look in the dictionary or in Wikipedia where it says close elections, Florida is the epitome of
Yeah.
close
It's
elections.
always Florida.
Exactly. As an Al Gore alum, I still have the scar tissue
Oh
from
God.
the 2000 race. And I can tell you that if we invest in these critical geographies, we can flip elections. Our
Yeah.
community can flip elections. And it's imperative we get smart on this now, because as you alluded to earlier, we are the fastest growing. And we are on track to be the largest minority in this country in about 20 to 30 years,
Yeah.
depending on the analysts that you listen to. So if we don't get smart now, we're going to play much more defense going forward.
Well, I mean, hopefully the latest census report has awoken people as well as to the growth in the Asian population, right? Once again, it's saying it's the fastest growing ethnic group in the country as well. So let me ask you this, though, Varun. I think the other issue that often is talked about and maybe not sort of pushed or emphasized, and I think the API Victory Alliance is trying to do this, is the better representation in terms of people in the political roles, right? As you said, campaign managers often they're very white, so they don't even recognize the need to cultivate, the community. But what about those running for office? Because I really do think that that's an issue of the lack of enough voices and representation. It's getting better. We can see that on both sides, right? You see representation on both sides, GOP and Democrats. But is that still something you see as an issue, a problem?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, we should recognize first and foremost that after Donald Trump got elected in 2016, there were record numbers of women and
Yeah.
people of color who stepped up, and many of them won office. You're absolutely correct. We are still underrepresented, however, in Congress and in state legislatures across the country. So we have been working with other organizations, and frankly, other organizations also have been taking the lead on this as well, which is we just need to further incentivize APIs to run for office and actually run for local office
Yeah.
because we need to build a long-term bench in this country, and we need to build it on the city council level, the school board level, the dog catcher level. That's where really where we need to build the bench.
Right.
That's not to say that you can't run for Congress, right out of MBA school.
Yeah.
You can, or law school. You can, but it is not, frankly, the tried and true method. And unless you have deep ties into your local communities,
Yeah.
uh, then it's really, really hard to win that way around because the power of incumbency,
Right.
right? 96% of all incumbents get reelected in Congress. And so it's really hard to break through that dynamic.
But Varun, we have seen some wacky things happen in politics lately, these days, right? Of people who absolutely have no business being in Congress all of a sudden being elected. So it happens. It definitely
It
happens.
happens, but it is not a surefire path to
No,
success.
you're right. Yeah.
Uh, and and the reason I sort of guide people in another direction, let's say, is because it sucks up a lot of money that could be spent on more qualified candidates who have deep ties to their communities.
Right, right. Let me ask you a practical question then, because a lot of people wonder why aren't more qualified people running for office? Well, sometimes the answer is because they don't want to get in the muck, right? It's a dirty business. And even if they want to run for office and have very good intentions, right? They want to make change for good. They want to help the people. They want to help their community. They get in and boom, it's just like a disaster, chaos, and everything that's kind of going on right now. And so a lot of good people are like, no, no, thank you. So how do we get good people? And I'll be completely frank with you, Varun. I have had several people ask me to run for office. Yeah.
Wow.
Oh yeah. Yeah, yeah. Like in all seriousness, because they feel like, oh, you at least have the media background, but you also have, sort of the political background because, I love studying politics, and then the AAPI background in terms of being a voice. But I absolutely said, no way, no
Yeah.
way. I wouldn't put myself through that. And that's a very selfish statement to make, but it's also because I've covered politics for so long that I would not have an interest. And so I know a lot of people feel that way. It's a shame, isn't it? Because I think a lot of good people actually would do a great job, but they don't want to.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that is absolutely part of the dynamic when people consider running. The dynamic has become so partisan.
Yeah.
It's gotten more and more partisan. All the studies have shown, increases of partisanship in this country. So it becomes hard. And if you have, there's a lot of downside in running for office, you're putting yourself out there, you're putting your family out there.
Yeah.
If you've got young kids, you're putting them on a stage that they don't necessarily want to be on or deserve, that sort of thing. So there is that downside. You have to be so single-mindedly tough and focused to want to run for office compared to, say, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, even 30 years ago.
Mm.
So I applaud anybody who is considering it. But
Yeah.
know this, that I think we need the best and the brightest
Yeah.
to run for office. There is still a dearth of good ideas out there, and frankly, our community, given the wide diversity that makes up APIs, from West Asia, Central Asia, all the way to the Pacific Islands and Hawaii, obviously, that we need that diversity of thought in elected office.
Yep.
We have not had the diversity of thought. It's been primarily, single-minded, white-centered focus for eons, and that is the history and the origin of our country.
Yep.
But that's exactly why we need to step up right now, because we have a lot to contribute, and I really appreciate you raising this.
And it's obvious that that better representation and that bigger voice in politics would help quell the ongoing problems that we see with anti-Asian hate and the rhetoric that was repeated over and over again by from the highest office of the land, over and over again. So that too, I think, ignited, like I said, we were saying at the top of this interview, that ignited, sort of a movement of people wanting to get more involved. So when it comes to anti-Asian hate, mainstream media has moved on, as we can see. It's not a topic of discussion anymore, but we all know within our community that it's happening still every day, nearly every day. From AAPI Victory Alliance perspective, what do you think are sort of the options or the solutions to this ongoing issue? And are you seeing, from political perspective, any kind of movement? I mean, President Biden at least has done much more speaking about it and passing legislation and, all of that. But is there more that needs to be done?
There's a lot more understanding and education and learning that needs to be done from the perspective of what are the root causes of all hate. In this case, particularly API hate, is ignorance.
Yeah.
It's there was a survey done, you might have seen. Some pollster asked the average American, who, name one Asian
Oh,
American person that
yeah.
right? And Bruce Lee and
Jackie
Jackie Chan
Chan.
came,
Yeah. Oh,
right?
no, but the number one answer was, I don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Absolutely not our vice president, of course, who is
Yeah.
Indian
Exactly.
American, Asian American,
Right.
not any, Senator Tammy Duckworth or Mazie Hirono
Nope.
or state
Nope.
legislators. So, but it really was, I think, indicative of this word I just used, ignorance, which is, if you don't know an Asian American or Pacific Islander, aren't you more apt to be incited by vicious rhetoric that we had seen over the last 4 years? Because it's like you're attacking someone you don't know. It's like you are. It's like we become that ugly foreigner that
Mm,
is used in this vicious rhetoric.
right.
And so we need deeper understanding on this. And this is one of the reasons why we at the API Victory Alliance launched a think tank, the first ever API think tank, about 4 months ago.
Mhm.
Is to find out, okay, well, what are some of the root causes of this hate? There's other things that we obviously want to research, like misinformation and disinformation, and how that proliferates, not only electorally, but how false information or misinformation can be weaponized. And it's being weaponized in the API communities. And it's often done on WhatsApp and WeChat. It's not done on Facebook as much, or Twitter, because they've got safeguards. It's, yes, a lot's happening there. But we need to find out, uh, how we attack this issue much more deliberately, and we can only figure that out through having the best and brightest thinkers in our country who are AAPI providing us some policy papers, which we then hope to cookie cutter into legislation, and then push that legislation out in states across the country and federally. So that's our hope, and that's why we got started this year.
Do you think there is that willingness and that openness to process that information and actually act on it, or is this just all sort of talk? Because the reason say that and put it that way is because, again, I feel like people have just moved on from the issue, and that it's past us.
Yeah.
We're done and on to the next. And so, therefore, is this yet another time in history where Asians were persecuted and, all of that? And then it's just nothing is really solved. So I wonder. I wonder.
I think so. I think we are in the early days of an AAPI movement that we have not seen since the term Asian American was coined in the 70s. And how I know that is because all the indicators are there. Massive political participation, an undercurrent of this hate and violence against our communities that is incentivizing us to act. Right?
Yeah.
We know
Yeah.
that the incidences of hate and crimes against our community is still on the rise. It hasn't dissipated.
No, not at all.
And so we don't know. We don't know. The optimist in me was hoping that once the first surge of COVID started to decline, it would the hate crimes would decline, and that hasn't happened. And now we're seeing this, obviously, this Delta wave, and so. And the FBI stats came out last week and provided a little bit more clarity on this issue, but we still know that most incidents of hate and crimes are not reported.
Right.
Right, so
Exactly.
it's just a sliver of the true picture, right? So, but at the end of the day, we are at this in the early days of this movement. Now, can it continue? No one knows, but here's why I think the optimist in me might prevail. And it is this. It is that I have seen engagement by AAPIs like I've never seen in my lifetime,
I
number
agree.
one.
I agree.
Also, I am seeing finally some movement in the philanthropic community. The new Asian American Foundation that was launched
Yes.
several months ago that raised,
A
$1.5
billion dollars.
billion
Yeah. In
and
record time.
in record time, several
Yeah.
weeks. And I hope that that might incentivize investment in API groups, ours and many others. So I see some shifts going on in the foundation world, in philanthropy. Too early to tell politically whether massive investments might come, but I think that this is a good thing. We need to continue to build this API infrastructure
Yep.
for that API movement to continue to foster.
Yeah.
But I'm starting to see early signals of that, and that's why I think that it may happen in the end. And where this goes, no one knows.
Yeah.
But each and every one of your listeners has to get involved, in even
Yep.
in the smallest of ways.
Yeah, and I say that all the time. Each one of us can make a difference in even the smallest of ways, but do something. Don't just sit there and do nothing. Um, Completely off subject, because I do want to just touch on this before we end this interview, is the Afghanistan situation. As we all know, the war has been declared over, and there was a massive evacuations going on. In fact, just recently, another plane was able to take off with more people on board. So, as we know, a lot of the Afghani refugees are here in the United States. And so that is going to be a process of assimilating and trying to get them, to the proper places and get their lives started again. So, when I first saw that happening, I was like, oh God, please don't let the racists in this country, start talking about like, oh, we don't want them here and all that, the usual stuff, right? That's where my head goes, just because I'm so jaded as a journalist. But Your thoughts on the situation and how the U.S. is going to be handling, the refugees here, and what we can do to help in any way.
Obviously, very difficult situation to see, us pull out in the way that we pulled out.
Yeah,
So we won't go there. I think everybody is feeling somewhat dejected
yeah,
about how that was handled, and what it led to. But um, what gives me a lot of hope is, for example, the Vietnamese American community giving a big bear hug to their their brothers and sisters,
yeah,
right? I mean, that brings a tear to my eye because they were in this situation in the 70s, right? And they are leading the way in many respects, out of many communities that want to help.
yeah,
Um, but they are, I think most folks who are still sort of reconciling rather with this term AAPI might not know that Afghans and now Afghan Americans are also AAPI.
yep,
They're the forgotten AAPI, right? Iranian Americans are AAPI, and often don't get recognized as such.
hmm,
And so I think that we as an organization, and other organizations, AAPI organizations and others, can also give a big bear hug to, these incoming Americans,
yeah,
uh, by giving them voice, allowing them time to heal, um, from the massive pain that they had to go through to even get on a plane. Perhaps family members who didn't make it, that are still stuck in the unfortunate situation with the Taliban now taking over the country. So we can all play our part there too, I would say. But I think long term, we need, this is why we need immigration reform as well, because there are pieces of being a refugee from a legal standpoint, an immigration standpoint, that has not been fixed quite yet.
yes,
And this is why we need the comprehensive immigration reform to give these interpreters and their families, and many others who are working with our troops, a pathway to citizenship
yeah,
that is clear, decisive, and quick.
yeah,
And
yeah.
we shouldn't have to make them wait.
No,
Uh,
no, and it
to
shouldn't be
be full
questioned.
Americans.
Yeah, it shouldn't be questioned because of their loyalty and their service, and their sacrifice, right?
Absolutely.
And I think Asians certainly can relate to this story
Yeah.
of being a refugee, fleeing conflict, or persecution. All of that. That is something that's very relatable to a lot of Asian American communities, because many of our family members had to go through that. So we need to have that sympathy and empathy, for others who are going through the same thing right now. Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Varun, it was such a pleasure talking to you. I'm so glad we connected this way.
It was my pleasure and
All
honor. Thank you
right.
so much for having me.
Keep doing the good work that you guys are doing, and we will definitely stay in touch.
Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. Well, hopefully that was educational for all of you, and perhaps inspirational, even though I was kind of bashing the idea of running for office because seems like a just, not a fun experience in this day and age. But I do believe that as AAPIs, we do need to have a bigger political voice and role, as well as in other industries, and in other roles. But we need to have that voice. We need to demand more recognition, and that politicians need to pay more attention to our needs, to our demands, and to our issues. So, listen, we just had a recall election in California. And it was a resounding no to recall Governor Gavin Newsom. Um, it was a landslide. So nothing is going to change in terms of the governor's role. But it does tell us that there is such great division across the country, even in a state like California that is, very much Democratic. But it was a moment where we had to stop and ask ourselves, what are we doing? What matters? What do we want? And so I think this was a wake up call for politicians, certainly for all parties, to figure out how this country should operate. Because right now it's kind of dysfunctional. It's kind of dysfunctional. And with California, this recall, it cost $270 million to do this election. $270 million was spent on this. For what? Um, for nothing to happen. Nothing changed, right? The governor stays in his role, but that money was wasted on a recall election. And the man who would have replaced him if the recall did go through was a man by the name of Larry Elder, a conservative talk show host, a radio show host. He's African American, but he has said some outlandish things about blacks and slavery and how slave owners should get reparations too because they got their property taken away because of the end of slavery. He has poo-pooed the women's sort of movement in terms of, women complain about sexual harassment too much. He has said some very, to me, crazy things. So that's what we were faced with, the possibility that someone like that could have taken over as governor in California. I don't care what side of, politics you're on. Um, we need to stop the craziness. We need to stop this insanity. Um, it is out of control, out of hand, um, chaotic, ridiculous, uh, and mind-boggling. So I don't have the answers, but I do know that we are going down a road that is just crazy town, right? And I don't think any of you can really argue that. Again, I don't care what side of politics you're on. We're kind of going into crazy town. So we got to rein this in and somehow become reasonable, civilized people again. Again, I don't have the answers, but let's have some open conversations, or at least think about it. Don't bury your head in the sand. All right. Okay, I'm gonna get off my soapbox now. Godzilla says shut up now. Okay, I'm gonna shut up now. Okay. Thanks for watching, everyone. I will see you next time.